I don't think of Elvis like that, because I've known too many artists, far, far greater than Elvis. What happened wasn't just irony, it was the final roar of an old lion, Ray Charles, before he vanished forever from the stage of life. He left behind no love song, no gentle farewell, no last verse to hum in the dark. What he did leave behind? A list. 10 names. 10 names that had haunted him, infuriated him, made him want to scream into the hollow heart of the music industry. These people are fake. To Ray, Elvis was never a king, just a spotlight turned up too high. Kenny G? Elevator music for hotels, he'd say. Sterile, soulless. And then there were 8 others, white soul angels, or as Ray called them, puppets pulled from record labels' zippers. You still think music is just for listening? To Ray Charles, music was sacred, the final voice of truth. And before he left us, he used that voice one last time to call out the names he could never forgive. This video is not for dreamers. This is the list. The 10 names Ray Charles despised and the brutal reasons why. What you're about to hear might make you question every record you grew up loving. But before we peel back the velvet curtain on soul music's most untold layers, hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe. Because your support keeps stories like this alive. Elvis topped the list with King crossed out and replaced with Thief in thick black ink. Picture this. It's 2002. Ray Charles sits in a small recording studio in Los Angeles. A camera rolls. Someone asks about Elvis Presley. Ray's response cuts like a knife. Don't ask me no more questions about Elvis. All he did was take our music and make money from it. This wasn't jealousy talking. This was decades of pain. In the 1950s, Ray Charles sang gospel in segregated churches. He played R&B in clubs where black artists couldn't even use the front door. Radio stations rejected his music for being too black. Then Elvis appeared. Same swing, same rhythm, same dance moves. But suddenly, everyone called it revolutionary. He didn't steal anything, Ray explained in a rare interview. But people stole from us to put it in his hands. The system was rigged. Black artists created the foundation. White artists got the credit. Elvis didn't have to be evil to become Ray's #1 enemy. He just had to exist at the right time with the right skin color. Ray would physically leave rooms when Elvis came on TV or radio. A close friend revealed Ray believed Elvis knew exactly what he was doing and chose to benefit from a racist system instead of helping the black artists who created the music he was copying. Ray once refused to perform with Elvis on television, not from arrogance, but because he wouldn't help blur the roots of black music. The wound ran too deep. Pat Boone earned second place with Sanitizer, written in angry handwriting. Ray never called Pat Boone by name. He just said, "That white boy singing it back," whenever Boone's voice came on the radio. Then Ray would turn it off. The silence spoke louder than words. Pat Boone was the great sanitizer. He took raw, emotional songs from black artists and made them clean enough for white living rooms. Tutti Frutti, Ain't That a Shame, Long Tall Sally. These weren't Boone's creations, but he got rich singing them. Record companies would literally give Pat Boone hit songs written and first recorded by black artists, asking him to create cleaner versions that white families would buy. The original artists denied airplay, denied recognition, denied money. Ray once heard Boone's version of Ain't That a Shame and actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was hollow. "He sings like he's reading someone else's speech," Ray muttered. The real tragedy wasn't Boone's success. It was that Fats Domino, who wrote the original, couldn't get his own song played on white radio stations. In 1983, Boone appeared at an event honoring black music legends. When he approached Ray to shake hands, Ray just stared into the distance. He lifted his sunglasses and turned away. Someone asked why. Ray's answer was simple. I don't know him. I just know his voice used to be played instead of my friends. That sentence revealed everything. This wasn't about Pat Boone the person. This was about a system that chose imitation over innovation, copies over creators. Bolton landed third place with copycat scrawled in capitals. That boy sings like he's wearing my skin, Ray whispered at a press conference in 1993. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't angry. He was devastated. Michael Bolton had become the king of painful love songs in the early 90s. He performed with symphonies. He duetted with opera stars. Critics praised his soulful voice. But Ray had been singing with that exact same emotion 30 years earlier. The cruel irony? When Ray sang with raw emotion, critics called it too black. When Bolton copied that style, they called it a breath of fresh air. The breaking point came in 1991 when Bolton won a Grammy, beating several black artists who had been performing that style their entire careers. Ray was watching the ceremony with his producer when Bolton won. Witnesses said Ray became so angry he threw his dinner plate across the room, yelling about how the music industry never changed. At the American Music Awards, Ray was invited to perform with new generation artists. Michael Bolton stood in the same lineup. When the host mentioned artists inheriting Ray Charles, the camera showed Bolton first. Ray turned away. He smiled for the audience, but inside, he was broken. Later that night, Ray wrote in his notebook, "How do you inherit a life you never lived?" That question haunted him. A voice isn't just sound, it's history. It's every rejection for being too emotional. It's every recording cut from radio for being too real. It's a mother's tears when her 7-year-old son goes blind but still learns piano by touch. Bolton didn't live through any of that. He just studied the technique and won Grammys for it. "I'm not mad he took my voice," Ray said. "I'm mad they gave it a new name." After watching Bolton perform Georgia on My Mind, Ray's signature song, Ray sat silent for a long time. Then he said, "He's singing the words, but he's not carrying the weight." Kenny G appeared fourth with Faker in bold letters. At a 1999 party in New York, surrounded by jazz legends, Ray Charles dropped a bomb. If Charlie Parker came back to life and listened to the radio today, he'd throw his horn in the river. Nobody laughed. Ray wasn't joking. Kenny G had brought jazz to millions of Americans. His saxophone was smooth, perfect, beautiful. But to Ray, this wasn't innovation. It was surrender. Jazz isn't background music for hotel dinners, Ray explained later. Jazz is something that makes people get up from their seats and live. Kenny G did the opposite. He made jazz safe, comfortable, unchallenging. Ray feared an entire generation would grow up thinking jazz should be gentle and easy. They'd never experience the haunting loneliness of Miles Davis. They'd never feel the chaotic genius of Thelonious Monk. "He doesn't break any rules," Ray told an old friend. "He just makes everything easier." That was the problem. Jazz was supposed to be difficult. It was supposed to have rough edges, mistakes, humanity. Kenny G polished away everything that made jazz alive. The final insult came when Kenny G started being called a jazz legend by mainstream media and won Grammy Awards in jazz categories. Ray felt this was a slap in the face to every real jazz musician who had struggled to make authentic music. Near the end of his life, Ray was asked about the future of jazz. His answer was immediate: as long as it doesn't get lulled to sleep. When asked if he listened to Kenny G's music, Ray smiled like he'd heard a joke. "I put it on when I want to forget who I am." Tina Marie was different from the others. The black community accepted her. Rick James mentored her. Motown signed her. She earned the nickname Lady T and genuine respect. But Ray Charles still couldn't embrace her. "She sings like she's been trained," Ray said in a private conversation. "But soul don't come from practice. It comes from pain." This confused people. How could Ray, who fought against racial prejudice his whole life, reject a white woman who brought respect to black music? The answer wasn't about skin color. It was about roots. Ray would sit for hours in recording studios, listening to raw vocal tracks. No music, no production, just voice. He listened for the breath between notes, the tiny tremor on the last word, the imperfection that comes when someone stops trying to be perfect. Of Tina Marie, he said, "She's got the pitch, but not the scars." That comment spread through the soul music community like wildfire. Everyone knew who Ray meant, but nobody dared discuss it openly. Ray didn't hate Tina Marie as a person. He respected her courage and admired her talent. But he couldn't forgive one thing. Music isn't a place to try to sound like someone else. It only has meaning when you sound like yourself, however clumsy, however broken. To Ray, Tina was like a clean mirror. She reflected everything perfectly but retained no soul of her own. In his diary, Ray wrote that Tina Marie sang like she was trying to convince people she had suffered when she had lived a comfortable life. Her voice had the right notes, but none of the scars that made soul music powerful. Harrison earned 6th place with SNOB written angrily. Sometimes the cruelest cuts come from people you respect. For Ray Charles, that person was George Harrison. Ray loved covering songs that moved him. When he chose to record George Harrison's love song, Something, he didn't do it to prove anything. He did it because he saw himself in those lyrics. He played piano with his whole heart, stretched his voice, brought emotion to notes that had been technical in the original. The result was magic. Audiences applauded. Critics called it one of the greatest covers ever recorded. Even Frank Sinatra declared that Ray made the song bleed. But when reporters asked George Harrison about Ray's version, his response was ice cold. "I like the bridge. That part did well. The rest didn't feel right. Not enough nuance." One sentence. No insults, no anger. But to Ray Charles, it felt like a slap across the face. Ray said nothing publicly, but friends noticed he folded up his notebook and never performed that song again. Despite being a legend, Ray Charles had thin skin, not from weakness, but because he was as sensitive to music as he was to physical touch. To Ray, music wasn't technique, it wasn't strategy, it was confession. When someone he respected judged it like a dish with wrong seasoning, he felt completely dismissed. What hurt more than the criticism was George's distant attitude. He never talked to Ray, never asked why he chose to express the song that way, never tried to understand the depth of experience behind Ray's interpretation. Ray didn't resent George Harrison. He just stopped mentioning him. In his final interview about covers he'd been proud of, Ray listed each name, each memory, but one song was missing from the list. When someone asked why, Ray simply replied, "Because some people like to keep their love locked up. I don't." Timberlake earned 7th place with Product in capitals. Ray Charles had seen it all. From his teenage years playing bars in rural Georgia, he'd watched beautifully dressed performers pretend to sing, pretend to feel pain, pretend to be authentic, all to sell records. But what tired him most was that after decades, they still existed, and they were more sophisticated than ever. In 2002, Ray was in a Los Angeles studio when a young record label employee played "Cry Me a River," Justin Timberlake's first solo single. The employee wanted Ray's opinion. Ray listened politely, nodding to the beat. Then he quietly turned off the music. "It's not bad," he said, "but it's not alive either." The employee looked confused. Ray continued. "Do you see any blood there? Do you hear cigarette smoke in his voice? Do you see a broken heart anywhere?" The employee chuckled, thinking Ray was joking. He wasn't. Ray once told a friend, "Music isn't something you do for showbiz. Music is something you play when the whole world isn't listening to you." To Ray, Justin Timberlake was the star of a world that listened but heard nothing at all. Meticulously crafted image, handsome, tasteful, easily digestible, but lacking the one thing Ray believed couldn't be taught: pain. Aguilera occupied 8th place with Screamer next to her name. Ray first heard Christina Aguilera not on stage, but through an old television in the studio. She was barely 20, sustaining a high note so powerfully it seemed her throat might explode. The audience went wild. The camera zoomed in. Ray sighed. Not because her voice was bad. It was too good, too technical, too much. Later, during a joint rehearsal before a television show, Ray met Aguilera. She approached him with sparkling eyes, still unable to believe she was standing beside a living legend. "What do you think of my singing?" she asked. Ray smiled, but the smile couldn't hide his weariness. "You've got pipes, girl. But what are you really trying to say with them?" That wasn't a compliment. It was a question Ray had asked himself hundreds of times. What am I truly saying? To whom am I speaking? Or am I just proving I can speak? To Ray, a voice shouldn't be a performance. It had to be an outlet, an authentic revelation so deep that you'd sit exhausted after singing. Not because you strained for a high note, but because your heart had just been laid bare to strangers. He told a friend after that session. "She sings like she's in court, trying to convince the jury she's been through hell." Ray believed true hurt doesn't need to be screamed to be heard. It just needs a whisper at the right moment. That's what he didn't find in Aguilera. Christina's name was later mentioned alongside new divas. People called her the second Mariah, or the Whitney of the next generation. But to Ray, that was exactly the problem. Aguilera's career was built on models of others, not on her own genuine wounds. "If you got to show the world you're hurting," Ray once said, "maybe you ain't hurt enough." Manilow appeared 9th with Plastic in bold letters. The concert hall was quiet. Red velvet curtains hung heavy. Cold air conditioning carried a strange scent, sterile, unnamed, like a dentist's waiting room. That's how Ray Charles described Barry Manilow's music. Clean, polished, without a single flaw, Ray heard a Barry Manilow song on the radio one Atlanta morning. His coffee hadn't even cooled. That voice, sweet, precise, hitting every note perfectly, sounded like it emerged from a laboratory, not a human heart. "He sounds like someone wrapped in plastic wrap," Ray told a bandmate. "You touch it, it's smooth, but you can't feel a damn thing." Ray never personally attacked anyone in his profession, but he reacted strongly to any music designed to make listeners feel absolutely nothing. To him, that was the greatest insult. Not to the audience, but to the spirit of the black music he grew up with. Ray remembered losing his sight as a child. Music was the only thing that told him the world was still breathing. An old harmonica from a thrift store never played a perfect note. But to Ray, it was more truthful than millions of albums because it couldn't hide its flaws. That's exactly what he couldn't stand about Barry Manilow. Once, a producer asked Ray if he wanted to duet with Barry. The idea was a historic meeting between two icons. Ray simply shook his head. "He ain't dirty enough for me." That statement wasn't about appearance. It was about lived experience, about the grit of reality, about blood in the horn and sweat on piano keys, things completely absent from sterile recording studios. In his final notebook, Ray wrote, Some folks sell albums, some sell truth, and some just sell polish. Barry Manilow belonged to the last category. The final name was Billy Graham, the famous evangelist, with hypocrite in angry capitals. There was a pain Ray Charles never forgot, not because it was loud, but because it came from the place he once believed was most secure, the church. As a child in Greenville, every time the organ boomed in the small church, young Ray, then partially blind, would touch the instrument's body like he was grasping light itself. To him, gospel music wasn't a genre. It was breath. It was the only thing connecting him to God in a world where his skin color, poverty, and disability pushed him to the margins. So when Billy Graham, a highly respected minister, declared that Ray's music strayed too far from the church's spirit, he wasn't just expressing an opinion about music. He was questioning the spiritual authenticity of a soul singing what it believed. The year was 1965. Billy Graham was at his peak influence. At a Southern Baptist convention, he stated, "The church is not a nightclub. Sacred music belongs to God, not the devil's playground." He didn't mention names. He didn't need to. The media, conservative leaders, and anyone who'd heard "I Got a Woman," Ray's song that fused gospel with rhythm and blues, immediately understood who he meant. Ray didn't fight back, didn't hold press conferences, didn't make public statements, but those close to him said he sat alone in his studio, hands on piano keys, for nearly an hour without playing a single note. To Ray, this insult didn't come from a singer or musician. It came from someone who claimed to speak for God. That wounded him deeper than any musical criticism ever could. He once confided in Quincy Jones, "If that man ever had to beg for supper with a piano, he'd know music ain't about genre, it's about hunger, soul hunger." Ray never considered music to be white or black, sacred or secular, right or wrong. To him, every note was a prayer. Sometimes that prayer was sung in a bar instead of a church, but it was still a prayer. After Graham's comments, Ray began doing something different. He incorporated gospel into every type of music he touched, from country to jazz, from ballads to funk, not to defy God, but to make one simple statement: the soul has no boundaries. Ray Charles's list wasn't born from bitterness. It came from a lifetime of watching authentic voices get buried while polished imitations rose to the top. Each name represented a different type of artistic theft, taking black music and making it acceptable for white audiences without crediting the creators. Valuing vocal gymnastics and flawless production over genuine human experience. Removing the rough edges, pain, and authenticity that made music powerful in the first place. A music industry that consistently elevated white artists, performing black styles while marginalizing the originators. Religious authorities deciding whose expressions of faith were valid. Ray had spent his entire adult life watching less talented white artists achieve greater success by copying his innovations while he struggled for recognition and fair compensation. The 10 names represent not just individual artists, but a system that consistently failed to provide equal opportunities and recognition to black creators who laid the foundation for American popular music. Ray didn't hate these 10 artists as people. He mourned what they represented. A music industry that often rewards imitation over innovation, polish over pain, and marketability over authenticity. When that authenticity gets replaced by polished imitation, something essential dies in the art form itself. The list doesn't diminish Ray's artistic achievements, but it provides crucial insight into the personal cost of being a pioneering black artist in a discriminatory society. Ray's anger was justified. His pain was real, and his contributions to American music remain immeasurable despite the injustices he faced. Drop a comment with the most shocking name from Ray's list, and hit subscribe for more Untold music legends.